Hello, welcome or welcome back. My name is Shannon, and today we're going to do a belated January and February wrap-up. I'm going to break this up into two parts. Today I'll talk about some of the fiction that I read in January and February, and the next video will focus on nonfiction. I decided that I'm not going to talk about every single fiction book that I read, or else this video will be very long. So instead, I'm going to focus on the 4 books that I read for a literary roundtable series that I attended in January and February. But if you do want to know every fiction book that I read, I do have them listed in my story graph, and my page is noted in the description. So let's get started. As I mentioned, I attended a literary roundtable lecture series, and we discussed 2 Bronte books and then 2 modern books to accompany these Bronte books. Basically, the premise of this lecture was the Brontes in their afterlives. What types of modern novels have been inspired by the Bronte sisters? Apologies if you see me looking down. I am looking at my notes. There's a lot I want to cover, and I have lots of feelings, and I want to make sure that I get them all out for you. The first book we read was Villette by Charlotte Bronte. Now, Jane Eyre is the only Charlotte Bronte book that I have ever read, so this is a first-time read for me. And I was actually really excited because I had wanted to read all of Charlotte's books. She's only published 4, I believe. Jane Eyre, by and far her most popular, Villette, Shirley, and The Professor. I have not read Shirley and I have not read The Professor, but I am looking into reading those later. This is the story of protagonist Lucy Snow as she tries to navigate life as a young woman completely alone in 1850s England and France. Villette is actually the town where most of the action takes place. It is not the name of the heroine. Villette is actually modeled on Brussels, Belgium, where Charlotte had been a teacher in the past. Little bit of background. Charlotte wrote this as a little bit of autofiction, and she wrote it after all her siblings were dead. She was the only Bronte child left. This was published in 1853, and Charlotte's last surviving sibling, Anne, had died in 1849. 2 sisters had died in 1825. Her brother Branwell died in 1848. Emily died a few months after Branwell died, and then Anne died in 1849. Needless to say, Charlotte, like Lucy Snow, was completely alone in the world. She did have her father, but all her siblings were dead, and she was alone. And I'm sure she was depressed, because you can actually see that depression in Lucy as you go through the novel. Not only did she give Lucy all of her feelings of loneliness and depression, she also gave Lucy similar life situations. Lucy was a teacher in a foreign country and falling in love with a professor. And Charlotte pretty much did the same thing. She was a teacher in Belgium, and she fell hard for one of her professors there at the school that she was teaching. We don't actually know why Lucy is all alone in the world. She never tells us what happens. She kind of teases us, but pretty much outright refuses to tell us. So we have absolutely no idea Lucy's backstory, why she is alone, what happened to her family, why doesn't she have any family or friends. After the unspecified disaster regarding her family, Lucy becomes a paid companion to a woman, and then that woman dies, and then Lucy is alone again. So now Lucy's trying to figure out what she's going to do. And somehow she makes her way to France, and she finds herself in Villette. She knocks on the door of a girls' school, a pensionnat, I think that it's called, and ends up becoming a governess to the owner of the school's children. And then she was made an English teacher. Now, this is where we spend the most amount of time. The first few chapters of the book are covering how Lucy gets to Villette. The rest of the book is set in Villette. And we now spend a lot of time with her in the school, and we are learning, this is really a character study, and we're learning a lot about her reactions, her thoughts on the locals, on the teachers, on the students. And Lucy's a bit of a snob. Okay, she goes on and on about how the English are superior to the French and how Protestantism is superior to Catholicism. There's a lot of that in there. She's very snobbish. And this is actually not surprising for that time period. The English really did believe that they were a superior race to everybody. Lucy is very reserved. She's emotionally self-controlled, but she also has sometimes just outbursts of feeling, almost like a toddler. Like you can't control it. And she does suffer from severe depression at times because she is so alone. She doesn't consider these French people as her friends, so she's lonely. And she honestly has no idea where her life is going. She's completely alone in the world. Another thing you'll notice about Lucy is she does not want to be beholden to anybody, and she values her independence. She is never in debt to anybody, financially or otherwise. And she is perfectly happy never getting married and then teaching school for the rest of her life and making an income. So, very independent. And because of that independence, she doesn't want to be in love with anyone because she fears that she will lose her independence by falling in love with someone. But as we all know, fall in love with someone she does. And she ends up falling in love with an older and autocratic professor at the school named Monsieur Paul. He is he is sometimes kind, he is sometimes mean. I feel that he is very manipulative, and I honestly can't see what Lucy sees in him. He is also a devout Catholic, while Lucy is Protestant. So this is very controversial. You just do not mix Protestants with Catholics. They just don't marry each other. And so this means that most of Monsieur Paul's friends and family are trying to keep them apart. Funny enough, he is totally fine with her being a Protestant, whereas apparently she's fine with being a Catholic, but with Monsieur Paul being a Catholic, but she still complains throughout the entire book about Catholicism. And then this book is supposed to have a Gothic element to it, and there is this little side story about the ghost of a dead nun in the school. But this little side story took a major backseat, and so I really would not call this a Gothic novel. I just wasn't buying the whole Gothic nun story in this book. What I did like, the story moved quicker than I expected. It's not fast paced by any stretch of the imagination, but I did actually look forward to reading it and turn the pages and see what Lucy was up to and what nonsense she was complaining about now. Who is she going to kvetch about now? Or what situation Lucy is not giving us all of the information. She withholds so much information from us. It's very frustrating. And then all of the characters are very varied and very interesting. So let me talk about why I have feelings about this book. My first reaction when I finished this book was, Lucy, girl, get over yourself. All right, just seriously get over yourself. The English Protestant superiority really was a put off for me. This was not in Jane Eyre, this type of superiority. And, there was the religious aspect to Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre had certain qualms about her relationship with Rochester, but this here just goes full on, just English Protestants are the best people on the face of the earth. It was a little bit of a put off. In that same vein, it was heavy on the religion, and there were many references, even with the annotations, that I just wasn't getting. And part of the problem is, if you're going to read anything in the Western canon, you have to sort of have at least a basic knowledge of the Bible. And although I went to Catholic school as a kid, I didn't really pay attention. And so I'm not picking up a lot of the religious references that are in this book, or even in a lot of the Bronte novels books. They were daughters of a clergyman, so they knew this stuff. She gives us no background on her past. She keeps things to herself. And later, when something happens, she then tells us, oh, I knew that all along. Like, I knew that. Like, girl, you could have given us some information so we could have figured it out on our own too. So the withholding of the information, the unreliable narrator was a little bit frustrating. I did not buy into the relationship with Monsieur Paul, and I actually felt nothing for the two of them as a couple. And I wonder if Charlotte really had a thing for older, manipulative men. Because if you think about it, think about Jane Eyre and Rochester. Rochester is an older man and he is very manipulative. Charlotte obviously has a thing for that type of man, and she put it full steam into Monsieur Paul. I don't know if the professor that that Charlotte herself fell in love with was this exact way, but it's possible that he was somewhat like this. I found him very manipulative. I did not buy their relationship at all, and I just thought Monsieur Paul was a jerk. And then the last thing that frustrated me was the ending. I'm not going to tell you about the ending. I'm not going to tell you how it went down, but it was so infuriating. And I went and did a little research, and Charlotte actually had a specific ending in mind. And then someone asked her, maybe it was her father, maybe it was the publisher, I don't know, to change it. So instead of changing it fully, she kind of did this half and half situation. And it's just very frustrating. So the ending I was not a huge fan of. But despite all my complaining about this book and all my feelings about Lucy and her unreliableness and her just bloated sense of superiority, I have had a couple of months to think about it, and I think I do like this book despite my initial strong feelings. And the fact that I had such strong feelings to me is actually a good thing. It means there's something in here that really affected me and really touched me. So I think I will read this again. Now that I know the story, I can go back and sort of just look at things that I missed the first time around. Even though this is not my favorite Charlotte Bronte novel to date, Jane Eyre definitely is better than this. I think I will definitely read this again. So that is Villette by Charlotte Bronte. The next book we read as a companion to Villette was Lucy by Jamaica Kincaid. Lucy was published in 1990, and this is a novella about 19-year-old Lucy, who comes from the West Indies to the US to be an au pair to a wealthy white family. Now, Lucy has never lived on her own. She's never left the West Indies. She's never seen anything, and she cannot wait to get out of the West Indies. However, when she does get to the US, she does have some homesickness, despite the fact that she could not wait to get out of the West Indies. And we find very early on that Lucy is very angry with her mother, although we don't actually find out why until nearly the end of the story. However, Lucy often wishes for her mother. She has all of these conflicted feelings. Now that Lucy is out from her mother's thumb, she is able to explore herself, her independence, and her sexuality. She has several sexual encounters with men and is determined to have no emotional attachment to her partners. She then will also explore feelings that she has for a female friend. So we have a young woman out in the world exploring herself and learning about herself. Lucy becomes close to Mariah, who is the mother of the children that she is nannying. And although Lucy has some affection for Mariah, she really does become disillusioned with their lifestyle. And I got to tell you, Mariah is very interesting. Lucy kind of sees Mariah and her own mother as similar because they both try to control her. There is a scene in here with Mariah about daffodils. I won't tell you the whole story about that. You'll have to read it yourself. But it was just a little bit of Mariah trying to force Lucy into something that Lucy specifically said that she did not want. The language in this book was amazing. I thought it was very raw, very honest, and I could feel Lucy's joy at being away from home, her anger at her mother. Just, I could feel all of it. Some people in the group that was part of the literary roundtable were actually very put off by Lucy's anger, but I wasn't. I I remember being a 19-year-old girl trying to figure yourself out, and it just did not bother me. This book is similar to Villette for a few reasons. First, this is autofiction. Jamaica Kincaid did live in Antigua, and she did leave when she was a teenager to become an au pair to a wealthy white family, I believe, in New York. And Kincaid did have some pretty severe unresolved issues with her mother. From what I understand, she actually cut off her family for like 20 years. So we've got the autofiction element. Both Lucys are very angry and very judgmental, and they both just want independence. The funny thing is, their anger and judgments and frustrations really are internal for the reader, because these two characters are actually quite popular with the people in their immediate communities. Lucy Snow was very popular with the teachers and the students, and Jamaica Kincaid's Lucy is she's got lots of friends, and she's got boys that like her, and the family that she nannies for really likes her. So people really like these two Lucys. So the anger and frustration that we're experiencing, I think only us, the reader, is experiencing. Both are young, both are very smart, and both are insistent about not being in love. Both are outsiders, racially, culturally, and religiously. I really enjoyed this book, and this is something I never would have picked up if I hadn't attended this roundtable. So I'm really, really excited to read more of Kincaid's work, and I've actually already picked up See Then Now. So I'm looking forward to reading this in the next couple of months. Jamaica Kincaid lives in Vermont, and during the school year, she is a professor of African and African American studies here in Massachusetts at Harvard University. The next book we read was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Now, I don't think I really need to go into detail on this plot, because I feel that most people know the story and have an idea what it's about. Basically, we follow Heathcliff, just Heathcliff, no last name, as he wreaks revenge on anyone and everyone who has kept him away from his childhood love, Cathy Earnshaw. This story depicts mental and physical cruelty, including domestic abuse, animal abuse, and is full of death. Everyone dies young, whether from illness, from alcoholism, from childbirth, and this is a very dark story with hardly any moments of light to give the reader just a breath, just to take a moment. People mistakenly think this story is a love story. However, it is more of a hate story, more of a revenge story. And the hate in this book is not only Heathcliff's, it permeates throughout most of the characters in this book. Personally, I very much dislike Heathcliff and Cathy being portrayed as the ultimate lovers, because I never saw much love in this story. It was more like possession, not love. They wanted to possess each other. And I also find that Cathy is the ultimate brat. All right. She has no redeeming qualities. I couldn't find any. Funny enough, Heathcliff actually does have a redeeming quality, despite the absolute havoc he wreaks. And his redeeming quality is that he actually stays true to her throughout the entire novel. And he even tells her that he will do nothing that will hurt her. However, throughout the entire time Cathy is alive, she runs around acting like a brat, went and married someone else, and then complains about it. For whatever reason, Hollywood latched on to this love story and pretty much distorted it. A lot of the movies would make Heathcliff this dashing hero, and A lot of times they would actually only cover the first half of the book. Kathy actually dies pretty much midway through the book. And the second half of the book is how Heathcliff takes his revenge, how he inflicts cruelty upon everyone now that Kathy is gone. So if most of the movies are only covering the first half, where you've got the two kids and they're growing up and they love each other and people are keeping them apart, and then she dies, well, on the face of it, that sounds pretty dramatic. Yeah, oh my gosh, that sounds like a dramatic love story. Well, Hollywood conveniently forgot to add in the second half with all of the awful things that happen. I think it wasn't until the 90s that they actually started putting the second half of the story into the movies. So from the 1930s, when I think the first version was made, into the 1990s, people thought that this was a love story. And now I can see why that thought has permeated throughout our culture. I have read this book a couple of times throughout the years, and during this reading, I found myself wondering if the reason I dislike Kathy and Heathcliff so much is because we are actually seeing this story through Nellie Dean's eyes. We're not seeing the story through Kathy and Heathcliff's eyes. So I wonder, if we had either Kathy or Heathcliff as a narrator, would I have felt more for them? Or do I think that Kathy is a raging brat because Nellie Dean portrays her that way? I don't know. So that was something I was thinking about this time. So now we have another unreliable narrator. Oh, speaking of Nellie Dean, she herself is not without blame, and I feel she oversteps her position way too many times and caused way more issues than she solved. And now I realize I cannot trust any portrayal of any character in this story because she is so unreliable. Some of the reviews at the time of publication state that the story actually had potential, but it was clear that it came from the pen of a new and inexperienced writer. And actually, I really do agree with that. This story came from a writer with a fantastical imagination and no experience on how to reel it in. It's almost as if Emily hadn't left Gondal behind her. For those of you who don't know, Gondal is the imaginary world that Emily and her sisters created when they were children. And from what I understand, Emily was still living and talking about Gondal well into her 20s. So it's almost as if she just couldn't get out of that fantasy, and she created another fantasy world and just didn't have the experience on how to reel things in. Now, after all that, after all of my complaining about how I really find this story to be dark and cruel, with no light, with unredeeming characters, there is a reason this book has endured for 180 years. It is an amazing work of literature, and Emily was a brilliant writer. You can tell, you can see it in the prose, you can see it in the language. You can also tell from all of the themes she explores. I mean, there is everything in here. There's nature, religion, morality, love, money, race. All of these themes beg to be explored. So now that I've reread it, and now that my adult self has realized that this is not a love story, I am going to go back and reread this at some point, and I want to explore all of those themes. I want to explore the language that she uses. There is a reason this has survived and why it's still being taught in schools. Now, I highly recommend this particular edition. This is the Norton Critical Edition because it contains so many additional goodies. We have a bunch of reviews that were published at the time of publication of Wuthering Heights, and it really does give Really great information here as to what the reviewers thought about the book. It also contains some poems of Emily's, some letters. It contains Charlotte's editor notes for the second edition of Wuthering Heights. And it also contains some essays in the back, which are really fascinating and give you more nuggets to explore in the book. One of the essays is about the religious aspect and how this has echoes of Milton's Paradise Lost. Another essay is about how she portrays the cruelty of animals and how the Victorians viewed animals at that time. And then there's another on intergenerational trauma. If there is ever a book about intergenerational trauma, it is this one, Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. The last book we read as a companion to Wuthering Heights was Glass, Irony, and God by Anne Carson. Now, this is actually a collection of poems and essays by Anne Carson, but we focused only on her poem called The Glass Essay, which was published in 1995 and has a bit of a mix of prose and poetry. The Glass Essay is about a woman who is visiting her mother's home in the Canadian moors after a breakup. And she weaves her meditations on this breakup with Emily Bronte herself and with Wuthering Heights. So she's exploring love, desire, suffering, and captivity. Because this isn't really a story, it's hard to describe, so I am going to read a couple of lines. Whenever I visit my mother, I feel I am turning into Emily Bronte. My lonely life around me like a moor, my ungainly body stumping over the mudflats with a look of transformation that dies when I come in the kitchen door. So we've got this woman, she's lonely now and she's thinking about Emily's loneliness on the moors. This section here actually really hit home for me. Yet her poetry from beginning to end is concerned with prisons, vaults, cages, bars, curbs, bits, bolts, fetters, locked windows, narrow frames, aching walls. Why all the fuss, asks one critic. She wanted liberty. Why didn't she have it? A reasonably satisfactory home life, a most satisfactory dream life. Why all this beating of wings? What was this cage, invisible to us, which she felt herself to be confined in? Well, there are many ways of being held prisoner. I am thinking as I stride over the moor. That bit actually hit home for me because one of the things when I was reading Wuthering Heights was trying to figure out where Emily came up with this. Where in her head did she come up with this? And for whatever reason, Emily must have felt trapped. For those who don't know the background about Emily, she had a hard time being away from home. She left home only a couple times in her life, and each time she got homesick to the point where she actually was physically ill. So she had some issues being home. And so maybe those issues being home, she almost felt like she was in a cage. I don't know. But I almost felt like I was being too hard on poor Emily when I was reading Wuthering Heights, and I'm complaining and hating Heathcliff and Kathy when I just sort of have to think, well, what did Emily go through to come up with these characters? What was she suffering? And the Glass Essay made me think about Emily and what she was going through. It made me feel kind of bad that I was so hard on her. I highly recommend The Glass Essay to read in companion with Wuthering Heights. As for the rest of the poems in this book, I read them. I personally did not enjoy them. However, there is an essay in the back that I did enjoy, and it was called The Gender of Sound. And this is where Carson discusses historical meanings in sounds attributed to women versus men. Carson goes into great detail how female characters in classical mythology make themselves objectionable by their voices, where they are viewed as animal-like and frightening, and they need to be shut up, like the nymph Echo, who was described by Sophocles as the girl with no door on her mouth. So Carson says, putting a door on the female mouth has been an important project of patriarchal culture from antiquity to the present day. Its chief tactic is an ideological association of female sound with monstrosity, disorder, and death. I found that very interesting. So if you do pick up this compilation, definitely read the glass essay and definitely read the gendered sound. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you have a great day.